David, tell me what slide I'm supposed to be on. I went back.
Yeah,
and...
go to 28. We're going to talk about the Fed and get into some of the details of what the Fed is doing.
Got it.
And then the next section after this will be talking about kind of what are some other ideas that are out there that different economists have for how to get us out of this problem. So you're probably hearing news that seems like every hour the Fed comes out with a new program. And I'll go through kind of what they're trying to do in a couple of slides here, but there are different parts of the financial plumbing that they're reaching out to. One of the challenges they have is if they cut interest rates, but the business sector is locked up, and investors and companies don't know if they can invest because they don't know when their customers are coming back. Everything sort of locks up, and people get very nervous and they start hoarding cash. And so there's a cash shortage. And what you're seeing lately was some funny things where bonds of all different types were being, other than treasuries, but bonds of all different types were being sold. And so you're actually seeing people trying to get cash or buy treasuries. They were selling other kinds of bonds, and actually bond yields went up. When people are busy selling bonds, the prices fall. A particular type of bonds, those prices fall and the yields go up. So if everybody wants to get out of munis, some of you may have seen that followed the muni market, that muni yields were going up a little bit because people were dumping them. So the Fed is watching all this, and they're saying, okay, where do we need to intervene so that Main Street can still get loans from the banks, that the banks can lend to each other, that things more complicated areas like the repo market are functioning. And what exactly are they doing to fix this? So we'll touch on a couple of these. And Bill, go to the next slide, please. All right, so if you're the Fed and you're sort of in the fancy control room and you're watching what's going on in the world, you get things like this. So the first slide, or the panel on the left, is the corporate bond yield relative to the Treasury bond. And so the idea here is that if there's a big difference in borrowing costs, meaning a much higher interest rate for a corporate bond yield, that means people are worried. They're nervous that a corporate bond might default. And so on March 17th, you see that big spike in the left-hand graph saying, there's a big spread or difference between those two interest rates. It's becoming more expensive for a corporation to fund itself. And so the Fed looked at that and they intervened, and I'll talk about how they did that in a minute. On the right-hand side, you have the amount, it's called the TED spread. It's the difference between the 3-month LIBOR rate and the 3-month Treasury bill. And what this means is it gets at the cost that banks are charging each other. So on the left-hand side was how expensive is it for a mid-grade business to fund itself. On the right-hand side, you have how expensive is it for a bank to borrow from another bank. And that also jumped up after being extremely low for a while in 2020, and the Fed intervened there to try to knock that number down. And that data is a little older now. I haven't seen it yet in the latest incarnation, but that's just to give you an idea of the Fed is watching these movements in different interest rates, and they have implications depending on what those interest rates are that they are analyzing. And there's a little more discussion in the lower right about the TED spread, and you've got some history here, but basically the Fed sees these things going the wrong way, and they act to stop it. The basic thing that they do is on page 30, Bill. The next slide. And this is a generic diagram of kind of what the Fed is trying to do. So there's all these huge banks on Wall Street in the middle there, and they're lending to Main Street businesses, and to people for mortgages and all this other stuff. And if the Fed starts to see this locking up, meaning the Wall Street banks are not lending, or they see that the rates that the Main Street businesses have to borrow and going up, and they will intervene. And so essentially what they do is the Fed buys bonds of different kinds. And normally they buy treasury bonds, and they buy mortgage bonds that are backed by like Fannie and Freddie. But what they're doing, a lot of these instruments that you've been seeing, a lot of these interventions have been expanding the kinds of collateral that they will buy. So they're buying different kinds of bonds. And as you remember from the financial crisis, when somebody gets a mortgage, that gets packaged up with a lot of other mortgages and then sold as a mortgage-backed security or a mortgage bond. That's the kind of stuff that the Fed buys. Wall Street packages that up, and Main Street, you're talking about, these are the people that have like the individual loans, one business loan, one mortgage. That stuff gets packaged up and then sold to the Federal Reserve, and the Fed has been expanding the kinds of things it'll buy. And so the good news, although this always shocks people when they hear it, that there is no limit on what the Fed can do, because they control the printing presses, the electronic printing press. If the Fed needs to buy $1 trillion in bonds, it can buy $1 trillion in bonds. If it needs to buy $5 trillion in bonds, it can do it. If it needs to buy 10, it could do it. So the Fed, and that's kind of what happened today, the Fed said, we will buy as much as necessary, whatever, and they just said unlimited. We will make a decision about how much intervention we need to do, and we will run the printing press, and we will, again, I say the printing press, it's electronic. They're not printing, greenback dollars, although they do that, but they're not doing that. They are running the printing press. They are running the electronic printing press and buying all these bonds, and that is keeping this channel open so that Main Street can borrow, the Wall Street banks can lend, and the banks can continue to do that because the Fed keeps taking these bonds off their balance sheet. I know that's pretty complicated, but that hopefully gives you a sense of if this starts to lock up at any point, the Fed will intervene to try to keep this happening. What you're seeing is banks are withdrawing lines of credit for businesses. So if, let's say, you're a business and you had access to $10 million, maybe you've got 8 now, or 7 or 5. And a lot of businesses that were smart and got in front of this took that line of credit already. And the banks are smart. They watched that and they saw their lines of credit getting pulled down. So the Fed also sees this. So we're really fortunate, I guess, in a way, in that we had a really bad crisis in 08 and 09 that taught the Fed how to protect the financial system. Also, so they've been able to intervene rapidly. I mean, these kinds of things happened over a period of months before in the 08 crisis, and now they've been happening in a matter of days. And we'll open this up to questions soon, so you guys can ask anything about these, and we can come back to that slide. But just wanted to give you a sense of what the Fed is doing, and that there is no limit on what they can do if they have to do it in terms of buying bonds and keeping this channel open. Next slide, please. This is just one other example. It's kind of like those slides I showed before. Commercial paper is a really important one of these markets too, where Main Street is borrowing from banks or investors like money market funds, for example. So if you're American Airlines, let's say, rather extreme example, and you need to fund yourself, you will issue commercial paper and get cash from a money market fund, let's say. That market started to get pricey as well, although not as much as it had been. If you see that spike there on the right to 0.8 percentage points, Fed saw that starting to happen, and they said, we're going to intervene here to make sure that commercial paper market is safe. And also, those of you that own money markets that you think of as 100% safe, back in 2008, a couple of, at least one, I remember a money market fund broke the dollar. So that dollar you had went to 99 or 98 or 97 cents or whatever, and the Fed intervened, there to make sure that that was taken care of. So they're watching this like a hawk. I think not too many, even Trump hasn't been criticizing the Fed for the last few days. All right, Bill, next slide. And this just shows you how the money market intervention works. It's another version of that same diagram I showed you before, but you've got a business that's issuing commercial paper and getting cash from an investor like a money market fund. And then the Fed can actually intervene and buy some of these commercial paper or bonds from these investors and keep the cash flowing to the businesses. And there's some statistics in here about how much money the commercial paper, there's about $1 trillion of that outstanding. And then money market funds have about 3.8 trillion in assets. When you give them cash every month, they might hold some of that as commercial paper, but they also hold other bonds, treasury bonds, other things. And so those funds have a lot of different kinds of assets in them. All right. Any comments on the Fed section? We'll pause here for questions. We can go back to any slide that you have questions about.
My one question is, when I've seen stuff like this in the past in terms of having it described to me, generally the big fear is that it's going to result in inflation down the road. What is your opinion of that?
I lose zero sleep about inflation when we're looking at possibly 20% unemployment. When
That's
inflation
true.
yeah, I mean, when you have to worry about inflation is when the economy is booming. Like if this were happening suddenly when the economy were booming and we didn't see distress in these markets and all of a sudden the Fed for some reason just starts cranking out, lowering interest rates, encouraging the economy to boom, that's when you get inflation where people are there's a shortage of goods and people are bidding for those scarce goods. That's where you get it. And so if we have inflation here, it would be something in a very specific area, and you're gonna laugh when I say this, but it's toilet paper. All right. If you're Walmart and everybody wants toilet paper, and there's people lined up for it and ordering it online, you can raise your price significantly. And so we could, in theory, have inflation like that. But the reason for the inflation isn't because the Fed's doing something and printed money. It's because there's a shortage of toilet paper relative to demand.
But I
And
think that's
what
something
drives up
completely.
prices.
Yeah, I think that's something completely different, though. I mean, what I see here, though, is the possibility for 70s style inflation, which admittedly is not the biggest threat. I agree with you. I think that I understand why this is being done, but what I wonder is looking out, a year or two into the future, one of the things that we may be struggling with is that we do have inflation and we have underemployment, and we're still seeing a lag in minimum wage relative to inflation that's now getting worse, and we have something that then goes on. We'll get over the immediate crisis, but we're going to see some really bad effects that are going to perpetuate for a number of years because of that.
And that's exactly why Trump is now talking about trying to alleviate this quicker. But you must remember that the trade-off here is financial problems versus tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands.
I do. And it is a trade-off. But the question is, okay, if we know that that's the trade-off, what are we going to do? How do we think through the next steps to deal with it?
Aggie?
Okay. We've been running $1 trillion deficit. Call it a stimulus, because that's what it is. It's a fiscal stimulus for quite a while. We've in fact increased the stimulus by $300 billion in the last 3 years, and we had basically zero inflation during that time. Now we have an economic downturn of pretty significant magnitude. We're going to see unemployment go probably up many points in the next few weeks. This is not the time when that can happen. The thinking on that you're referring to, the 70s inflation caused thinking, it doesn't really work. It was attributed to the wrong cause. Frankly, it was attributed to the cause that was desired by the capitalists. They wanted to blame labor. They wanted to blame that kind of thing. It was in fact not that, and but it's a very popular thing, and it's stuck in people's minds. But in fact, it was a wrong attribution in the first place.
I'm not arguing against doing what we're doing here, what we're seeing here. All I'm saying is we're talking about, yes, we're running $1 trillion deficit, but we're about to pump into our monetary system 3 or 4 times that amount of money in a very short period of time. And we have to. I think that there is no question that we have to. I think that if in fact there is the trade-off, it's a trade-off we have to make. However, given that, it seems to me that a wise analysis to go forward is, okay, let's think about some contingencies. One of
The people looking at modern monetary theory would say that in fact, like I'm saying, you're stuck with an old paradigm, and we are going to dump, let's say 3 trillion. Let's say we do 3 trillion. between the Fed and some of these stimulus bills. How much are we sucking out of it when people don't go to work? Consumers are 70% of the economy, and it's I don't know how many trillion economy, but it's rather large. We're sucking a lot of money out of it. Probably going to about come out even.
Well, anyways, let's not go down this rabbit hole anymore. Why don't you go on?
Okay. As you know, though, the Fed is obviously going to be incredibly aware of this, and they will ratchet back on their programs if they see inflation start to get out of whack, I can assure you. Let's go to the next section, slide 34. And this is the sort of ideas that economists have put out there, and some of this has already been adopted in some of the fiscal policies we've seen, so I won't dwell on some of these. But what happened really early in this crisis is you started to see a bunch of economists put out blogs or write short papers and kind of summarize what their thoughts were on this. And so this first one is from Greg Mankiw. He's actually he's a Harvard professor. He's the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush, and he's a noted conservative economist. And as Paul Krugman likes to say, might get this wording wrong, but those of you that follow Paul Krugman know this, that there's conservative sort of hack economists. He calls them professional conservative economists. These are guys like Stephen Moore who just make up stuff like tax cuts pay for themselves. And then there are economists who are conservative. And Mankiw is of the later variety. He writes the Harvard textbook. He thought voodoo economics is voodoo economics. I mean, he's a credible source of information. He just comes at it from the conservative side. And so what he's saying here is a list of things he's talking about, but he wants to, he said, get the checks out there right away. Give Dr. Fauci the anything he needs from a medical standpoint. Spend the money to get the medical supplies out there and attack this virus and try to hammer it down as fast as we can. Don't worry about debt. Payroll tax doesn't make any sense right now because it's not targeted right. People are out of work, so the payroll tax doesn't help them. The payroll tax is good when in the financial crisis, about 6% or something, but was it 6-7% of people lost their jobs, so 93% of people were working. A stimulus then that really works well. You got 93% of the people, but if you've got a huge percent of the people out, this isn't gonna do a lot of good. And it worked actually. Trump originally started down that path and changed his view, so that he contributed to that argument. He's a very well known and followed guy. And also he used some very colorful language. The actual statement was President Trump should shut the hell up and defer to those who know what they're talking about. I just didn't want to put it in print. But he's not a Trump fan, but he is a conservative, so I put that on here. Next page, please. Now, you guys have heard of Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman, and they are the guys that are sort of the income inequality gurus. They're the ones that are working on the national distributional accounts so that we can see, it's not just about GDP, but who is GDP actually benefiting? Whose incomes are really going up based on where they are in the distribution. And they've made a lot of progress over the last few years, and everybody knows Piketty by name. He's very famous all over the world. His book was very famous on Capital. But Saez and Zuckman are his right and left arms, and their view here is they've changed it actually. This is their old view. They got a new one, but their old view was, if you're an airline, the government ought to just buy your tickets for now, and you keep your workers. In other words, they're the customer of last resort. The government just steps in and just buys everything up. And not mechanically, but if American Airlines did $50 million in business and the government wants to maintain them at that level, they just give them the money to get them there. Their view was sort of, there's a lot of words here, but it was the buyer of last resort. You always hear of the Fed as the lender of last resort. They said the government should be a buyer of last resort and buy this up. They've changed their view now, and it's more along the lines of they cover the cost of companies, kind of what we'll talk about here in a minute, the Denmark and UK model of covering the cost of businesses. But this was their original recommendation that they put out there, and they've modified it. Next slide, please. Bill, please, the next line is Elizabeth Warren had tweeted out 8 requirements for a big company bailout.
Right.
And there's a list of them here. These are the kinds of things that I think would be on the liberal wish list in terms of the bailout. Any bailouts would be just not allowing companies to do the kind of nonsense they did in 2008 and 9 that made people so angry. Paying bonuses and doing stock buybacks and dividends and all this stuff that, pay back the loan before you start going back to that kind of stuff again. And in her case, she wants a permanent prohibition on stock buybacks. You can see in the lower right, there's about $23 billion worth of stock buybacks in the last decade, a little bit more concentrated for American Airlines in that period, but those are just 2 airlines. I'm sure there's a few others that I just didn't have the stats handy, but there's a lot of money out there. And if these airlines are going to face a pandemic, possibly every few years, and maybe even a couple rounds of this one before we get through it, then, are we going to let them just sort of run without a financial cushion, or are we going to put the kind of regulations on them we put on the banks so that they're in a better position when a crisis like this happens? My wife works in banking, and she said, people, as much as they're hating to admit it, she works in a large bank, the executives are glad that the Dodd-Frank regulations forced them to maintain a good capital and liquidity buffer, meaning we had enough cash to keep themselves safe when this all hit. They weren't overextended like the banks were back in 08 and 09. And, Trump has been trying to dismantle that regulation, but a lot of those changes won't take effect until the end of the year, at least for banks of her size. So this idea that you regulate these banks so that or these companies so that if they're the kind of bank that are kind of company that is susceptible to a pandemic, that they would have a much stronger cushion so that the government doesn't have to bail them out to the extent that they would otherwise, assuming the government chooses to bail them out. This idea of sort of not pandemic insurance per se, but at least having them in a strong financial position all the time without, immediately calling for a bailout, 3 weeks after the demand falls off a cliff. Next slide, please. Pardon, I couldn't resist the Shakespeare reference. Denmark is covering 75% of the cost of the salaries of their employees up to a certain amount, 90% of hourly wages. And they're asking workers to give up some of their paid vacation time. There are some exemptions, but otherwise they are just jumping in sort of on that second idea that the economists Saez and Zuckman had, which was to come in and handle all the costs, not give them all the revenue, but give them, not the customer side, but just cover the cost. And the UK announced a few days later that they were going to do the same thing. So this is a very different strategy from the one we're doing here. It's sort of the unemployment on steroids, but beyond that, keeping people employed in place, not just letting them go to the unemployment line, but keep them there and help the companies do that. So I like this model a lot. I think it's simple, it does the job, and it's on the right scale. Next slide, please. There's a few other ideas here about suspending certain kinds of payments, credit payments. So whether it's cars or student loans or mortgage payments. I think this mortgage payment piece has been expanded in other countries as well, but Bank of America is, if you have a Bank of America loan, you can call them and they'll pause your mortgage payment and add it to the end of the loan. They do that on a case-by-case basis. So there are companies that are stepping up. I haven't heard other ones doing this, but I bet if Bank of America is doing it, then other ones will follow them. Now, Mark mentioned earlier this idea of MMT. Right now, the Fed doesn't have this authorization to do this, but it is theoretically possible for the Fed to print as much money as it wants and deposit that in your bank account. It has to be authorized by the Treasury to do that. And the Treasury could issue bonds for that purpose, meaning the Fed just buys the bonds and prints all the money from the Treasury and it deposits it into your account. Or there's this idea you'll sometimes see, which is the idea that the Treasury doesn't even have to issue the bonds and give them to the Fed. The asset that the Fed needs is just to print $1 trillion coin. And this came up in 2008 and 9, it has certain technical, and I don't understand all the nuances, but apparently the Fed or the Treasury, well, the Treasury would do it physically, but print $1 trillion or $1 trillion coins, and then the Fed prints $2 trillion, drops it into the Treasury accounts, and then they can send it out to all the banks into our individual checking accounts. They're not, the Fed can't do that right now, but apparently they could accomplish it this way if the Treasury authorized it. So when you hear people say the Fed is out of ammunition, or the Fed, it's already fired its bazooka, it's out of it, that's all baloney. The Fed can print as much money as it needs to, and then it can always print as much as it wants to print bonds, and then print as much money as it needs to buy bonds, as I explained earlier with the Fed intervention. But when it comes to this idea of depositing money into our bank accounts, there's a couple ways to accomplish it. It buys the treasuries directly from the government. That's called monetizing debt. Japan's been doing that for a long time, and they haven't collapsed. Their debt ratio, their debt to GDP ratio is way, way higher than ours, double or almost triple ours. And then there's this minting the coin idea, which you can go looking for this mint the coin idea, and you'll get some of the information on it. It's also in Rep. Tlaib's proposal. Her version of that Maxine Waters bill was have the Fed print mint those coins, and put the money into our bank accounts. All right, next slide, please. And some of the other international policy responses, I won't dwell on this, but they're doing a lot of the same stuff we are. So central banks doing their interventions. The UK is doing a huge stimulus. And I wonder if the UK has changed that a little bit because of their what they're doing with keeping the payrolls of companies now, the Denmark model. So I'm not sure if that's current information or if it is, but it's just being fun. They're using it for a different purpose. And then, of course, the EU is doing a lot of the stuff that the Fed is doing. And I think, normally the Fed doesn't buy corporate bonds, but I think in this circumstance, it's gotten authorization to do that. It's also got authorization to buy munis to some extent. So they're getting innovative in terms of what kind of bonds they buy. And if you haven't heard this before, and I don't have the numbers lately, but the bond market dwarfs the stock market in terms of value. The bond markets are enormous all over the world compared to the stock market capitalization. I'll pause there on this section. Any questions?
Just some notes that you're making a lot of good sense.
I mean, this stuff gets pretty complicated, but the Fed. The good news is that we can control the dollar. Well, you can never run out of them. As one person brought up earlier, you can have inflation. That is your constraint on how much money you can generate. You could, in theory, take action that causes inflation, but it's not likely to happen when you're in a deep recession or there's a lot of uncertainty. Where you could get that would be most likely if you sort of threw stimulus onto an already booming economy. Then you could see that's where your inflation risk is greater. All right, only a few more slides here. Next section, page 41. So Carl brought this up is, the way that we normally define a recession is a couple quarters of negative economic growth. So you always hear the statistics every quarter. GDP grew at 2% this quarter. GDP grew 2% this quarter. If we had 2 quarters of negative growth where, GDP fell by 1.5% this quarter, if we had 2 quarters of that, that's the typical definition of a recession. And there's a more formal definition from the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. And there's also, though, if we had a massive collapse in the second quarter, but we recovered in the third, it's arguable whether you would say you're in a recession. There are some economists that, in their view, we're already in a recession. So, but that's not the official version. So that's kind of something to think about is, okay, if people start throwing around the word, we're in a recession, not by the common definition, but we're certainly the economy is slowing down and at a very rapid rate. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an interesting slide. My wife's uncle is an economist. He may not, but he wasn't able to make it tonight. I had suggested he'd come to one of our future meetings. I want to get him in here maybe next month and ask him to give his commentary on some of this. He's a brilliant guy. But this is a slide that kind of says at the top, it says, you want containment help from a healthcare standpoint. You want containment policies to push down that curve. We talked about this earlier, that the healthcare system can handle this and the economic shock is minimized. However, by doing those containment policies, you're going to slow down the economy. You're telling people to stay at home and not spend. And so by doing all these different things that the Fed is doing, the government is doing, that's that green upward arrow of economic policy. And so you mitigate some of the damage that's done that just not providing that stimulus would do. And this is fundamentally what the government's job is when, in my view, in the economy should be to act what they call counter-cyclically, meaning if the economy is tanking, that's when the government steps up. And if the economy is booming, that's when the government should back off. And Keynes has a famous quote around that, something to the effect that the time for austerity at the Treasury is during the boom, not the bust. Something like that. He says that. In other words, when the economy is booming, that's when you raise taxes and cut spending. And when the economy is slow, that's when you increase spending and cut taxes. And, we're in that stage now where as you see here, the government is trying to act to stimulate because we're getting hit incredibly hard by these things. So that's I think this is a great slide. I really like. I'm not sure where it came from. He sent it to me, but he didn't attribute it. I'm not sure. I asked him where he got it, but he didn't get back to me. But if you haven't seen it before, I thought this was really a superb diagram. The next slide, this will give you an example of an incredibly optimistic forecast. This is Wells Fargo, and I think after changing their forecast like every week for a while, they gave up and they just left it. So what they're saying is, this was as of the 16th, GDP they thought would fall single digit, 3.3% in the second quarter, 2.3% in the third, with a rebound in the fourth quarter. They're pretty optimistic about this. And the unemployment won't change all that much. I shouldn't say that. It'll go up to 5, but 5% unemployment is below historical average. Historical average unemployment is about 5.8 or 5.7%. So they're saying worst case, not worst case, but they're saying our forecast is we get back to more normally, but still better than average unemployment. And inflation, they expect to actually go the other way, to go south for a while, because there's just not enough demand in the economy and price levels fall like they did in the Great Recession. Now, in the blue over here is what Goldman Sachs is saying, and other banks are saying stuff more like this. 25% declines in the second quarter, 9% unemployment. I've heard there was a Fed economist, I think he's a former, although he could be a current, said something like 30% decline and maybe as high as 20% unemployment. And that's something that Mnuchin said as well, as the Treasury Secretary, was 20% unemployment possibly. We have 160-ish million employed people, part-time and full-time, about 160 million. So if each 10% of that is 16 million people. For scale, in the Great Recession, about, I think, Carl, correct me here, it was 9 million lost their job?
On a net basis, yeah, 8.8 million lost their jobs on a net basis, and unemployment peaked at 10% of the U3 rate.
No, thank you. So, they're talking, there's quite a range here among economists, but I think I'm leaning more toward Goldman Sachs than I am toward Wells Fargo. Again, as Carl mentioned at the beginning, there's a ton of, we don't know. This thing could go better than we think, and this thing could go worse. You probably heard President Trump dropping hints about wanting to sort of, suck it up and put people back out there to get hit by this disease and get immunity. They call it herd immunity in the population. The UK dabbled with that, and then they went the other way big time. So they, as my understanding, is that they reversed themselves quickly and said, "Ooh, that's a bad idea." Or, I mean, we don't have, and I'm still waiting for this data, and maybe somebody's got a better source of it than me, but I'm still waiting for statistics on masks, on number of beds for intensive care, number of respirators. These things can't be made overnight. And every time Trump says China virus and annoys China, you might have seen the news the other day that China thinks they're starting to get past their peak point and maybe in a position to start shipping respirators and other supplies to countries. And here we are, Trump trying to score cheap points for some reason, saying China virus. It's just dumb. He's putting a lot of people at risk with that kind of dumb. I don't normally, I'm not a Trump fan, obviously, but that's really stupid, in my view.
2 points.
That gets
2
me over.
points.
That's a really
Somebody got to him today. His press conference today, he backed off the China virus thing. It was the same sort of incoherent self. But also during Pritzker's press conference, they promised numbers on exactly what you're talking about for Illinois tomorrow. So assuming we can extrapolate to the rest of the country from Illinois, which may be a tough bet, we may have a better idea tomorrow. There are people putting exactly those stats together as we speak.
Hey,
David, this is Jim McGrath. Question for you on those curves that you had on the previous chart. Does that containment assume that the entire nation is on lockdown? I mean, because right now, with 5 or 7 states on lockdown and the rest not, I don't see how we're going to get through this in even 8 weeks.
I don't know the specific answer, but I would say generically, it's just, think of this slide as being directional and not precise. It's not saying, it's saying, the stronger your containment policies, the more likely you're going to have that, you're going to be like the blue line instead of the red line, up there. You're going to push that steeper bell curve, flatten it out as above the dark, on the top of this graph. And the bottom, though, the stronger your containment policies, the worse that blue dotted line is going to fall to the bottom, right? So
yeah.
you are deliberately saying, I am going to trade off. And, with enough ingenuity between the Fed and the government, we should be able to ease the pain that a typical person feels financially while we go through this, while we're busy dealing with the healthcare issue, keeping people alive.
But the other thing, the other thing you need to realize is as we flatten the curve, as we ensure we don't overwhelm our healthcare resources, we also lengthen the time that it takes to get through the whole thing. So if we do less social distancing, then we'll be over this in 2 months, but thousands of people will die. And if we do more social distancing and keep businesses closed longer, then fewer people will die, but it'll take longer to get through the whole thing.
That's right.
I agree. Trump was talking today about his 15-day moratorium is up next week, and he was saying, well, he wants to get back to normal next week.
Yeah, that's nonsense. Total nonsense.
It's total nonsense, and that until he takes a national stand in this, I think this is going to be a long-term problem.
Just to put a perspective on this, you guys are throwing around thousands of deaths. If you remember the UK study that came out last weekend, said that if we weren't doing any kind of containment, mitigation, suppression strategies, the U.S. would have 2.2 million deaths. Not thousands, 2.2 million. Right. And what we're trying to do with the policies that people are proposing is, and the states are implementing, is bringing that number way down. I mean, there was a senator who said, only 3.4% of the people die, and then somebody pointed out to him, 3% of 300 million is a whole lot of people.
A lot of people.
Yeah. So
And the things we do so far, social distancing cuts that in half. Closing businesses can cut it even more than half, but it's still 500,000 people. And when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and we're comparing that to some businesses going bankrupt, that's an easy decision for me.
Well, and again, if we can do something with keeping the businesses open by running a bigger deficit for a short period of time, you know, that makes it an even easier call for me to go ahead and let's support the people who are unemployed, let's support the businesses, and let's get through this with a lot smaller number of deaths. I think either line probably has, you know, doesn't go to zero until we get to the 12 to 18 months where we have a vaccine. So I think that there's some things on this graph that are really misleading, you know, and not appropriately drawn, but I mean, it's a decent concept to you go with the idea that with, you know, again, containment that's out of the barn right now. We're either in mitigation, which is social distancing, or we're in suppression, which is shutting down businesses. I think are the terms that the epidemiologists use.
The thing you're missing here in this analysis is how it relates to our healthcare capabilities. We need to minimize deaths. We need to slow the whole thing down so that it doesn't hit us all at once and hits us slowly enough that we'll have enough hospital beds to take care of everybody for 3 weeks when they need care for 3 weeks. But that means that it takes more than 15 days. For goodness sakes, it probably takes more than 2 months.
Yeah. The other thing in terms of this, in terms of, you know, we can, you know, import or manufacture, you know, masks. We can manufacture ventilators. We can, you know, build a hospital or unmothball some of the hospitals that are closed to get hospital space. But finding enough ICU doctors and nurses to take care of all those patients is a bigger problem.
Yeah, and this is something that, you know, we're going to end up fighting the last war, I think, in the future on this one, in the sense that we are going to hit some of these capacities because most healthcare providers, the hospital chains, et cetera, are running near capacity even before all this happened. They're designed, the market forces that work on them, they're basically designed to do just that. So like, for instance, a good example is that hospital tower that was built outside Northwest Community Hospital. All of those, it makes it look like they expanded capacity, but they actually reduced it because almost all of those rooms are single capacity. That's been going on all over the hospital industry. We haven't been keeping up capacity in either beds or doctors or nurses for a long time because excess capacity costs a lot of money to maintain. And I think we've just learned a very, very painful lesson. We're about to learn it even more over the next couple of months. What happens when you don't have that excess capacity? And putting it in perspective, we're talking about paying airlines for empty seats, having government pay airlines for empty seats. This is what we should have been doing all along with the hospital industry so that we had the capacity to deal with things like this. But we didn't. And we're going to have to going forward.
We actually, as a government, buy 90,000 eggs a day so that we have the capacity to create the serum necessary to create the inoculations. I mean, we know how to do this.
Yes. I mean, that's what the whole strategic oil reserve is about, is making sure that we have enough oil on hand for an emergency. But we're not doing it with healthcare, which just drives me crazy.
Excellent. Okay. I think the other slides are pretty similar ideas. So slide 44 is an estimate from the Financial Times saying their back of the envelope calculation with preliminary data is China's down somewhere about 25%, which gets you closer to that Goldman Sachs sort of idea of the impact on the economy that something like this could have. They had some innovative ways of measuring it. The page 45, the next slide is just asking economists, this is March 12th, whether they think we'll have a recession, a serious recession or not. And it seems like most of them think we will. There's some uncertainty, but when you look at the strongly agree or agree, it's about 50%, a little higher. This is, I'm sorry, not 50%. It's about, it's 50% for the agrees, and it's uncertain. And one of the things about these that I don't understand, I'll have to confess, the University of Chicago does these, is their stuff on the left doesn't add to 100. Like, how does this happen? I'm not sure if they, I just don't know why they do it this way, but you at least get to see the relative size of these things. Then the confidence ones on the right, I think, do. But it's, they're still not convinced that it's going to be technically a recession, but I think if you asked them today, they probably would have changed their tune. Carl, I was going to treat the rest of this stuff as appendix, meaning we're basically done with the presentation we plan to do. As Carl mentioned earlier, there are some statistics on the different slides that are in here. Let me mention a couple of them. Let's do page 47 for a second. This is one of our favorite slides. This is Carl invented this as far as I'm concerned. Washington Post learned from Carl how to do this. I saw he started talking about it before they did. Obviously, after this month, it's not going to make sense to really compare these anymore. And I guess when we PDF these lines start slipping. They look nicer in the PowerPoint when you look at the PowerPoint. But Obama defeated Trump in terms of the jobs created in his last 37 months versus Trump's 37, and we won't have comparable numbers really anymore because the end of the Obama administration was good, and the beginning of the Trump administration continued that, but then we're going to hit this crisis and these numbers are going to fall. It's possible. I don't know, Carl, I guess how would that work? But I guess Trump's number could theoretically go towards zero.
It could. Again, remember that we have one more month of decent reported numbers for Trump because they took the surveys for March, the week that contains March 12th, which means the week that ended last Saturday, a week and a half ago, and we didn't have the major cutbacks, the forced layoffs by the states as of that point. So we may still have a small amount of job growth in March, officially.
Yes, one more month. Okay, one more month this will be comparable, and then after that, I think it's over. So Bill was always asking, because he's trying to convince his Republican friends in his current events group to believe these numbers. They never want to believe them. After this month, it won't even be a fair comparison. After next month, as Carl pointed out, it won't be a fair comparison anymore.
No.
It just won't. Yeah.
Once you get to April, we're going to see big job losses, and then how we're handling this from a public health standpoint is going to affect what July, August, September, and October look like.
Yeah, no, those are good points. We got the final numbers, and I don't know, Carl, you might have to correct me here. In the last job report for February, they were still adjusting the 2019 number. I don't know if they're going to do that again in the next one or not, if this is truly final, or if they might modify December. But here's how it looks for the number of jobs created for the full year. And you can see that all three, after adjustments, because there was a big write-down in the number, all three of Trump's years were below the last three Obama years. So all three of those reds are Trump years. And Carl's mentioned before, sometimes one way to analyze presidents is you don't take that first year, you wait for the second year. But, that said, those 3 years were all below even Obama's lowest year in his last three. They were below that 23.45 from 2016. That said, the unemployment rate continued to fall, and I think that's a number that people feel pretty seriously too. So, that's it. But I wasn't going to cover others. You can look at these other slides on your own. Those are the slides that we cover in all of our presentations. So I guess we can open it up for any final questions and comments.
Well, don't forget to jump to slides 55 and 56. Take action.
Thank you. So 55, everybody knows this, but clean your hands, wash your hands a lot. And when you think about it, if you are still somebody who's going out to get food and bring it home, that's where you're leaving your house, and that's where you're starting to take some risk. And so when you are, unpacking all that stuff, and one of the pieces of advice I saw was, take anything out of the dishes you get, put it in your own dishes, and throw out that stuff that is from the third party, from the restaurant. Wash up real carefully. Don't have their dishes in your fridge, and also wherever possible, put the food that you're receiving, nuke it again if you can. And I haven't seen a statistic on this. You guys, I haven't looked at it, but maybe somebody knows. But put it in the microwave for a while, and hopefully kill off any critters that are still crawling around on there. I think you're aware of the other issues here. The next page talks about just protecting other people and being courteous. If you're sick, to avoid them. Keep where you live clean. Just think about, if you see these movies like Outbreak and others, it's so easy for these germs to be transmitted, whether you got a delivery and somebody sneezes on your delivery, or, there's no rule that says you must get your mail every day. And if when the mailman comes, wait a few hours before you go get it. There's no rush to go get your mail right away. I mean, things like that you don't think about normally. Just don't let stuff sit for a while, or nuke it before you eat it. It's that kind of common sense. I don't know what challenges you guys have had. We've had challenges trying to order food. In terms of the grocery stores delivering stuff, they're often out of stock, or they're having trouble with it. My wife was able to find some stuff and order it, but it's just, you want to also minimize your visits to a place. So when you go to a supermarket, think about all the things you're going to need so you don't miss anything, and go there and check your list carefully before you leave. If you're going to be there, minimize your exposure. I don't have anything else. Maybe you guys have some safety tips you've heard.
Well, one of the big things that I heard was, minimize your social groups. We talk about keeping, groups to, 5, 4, 3, 2 people. But if the people you're socializing with are socializing with other people and socializing with other people, you end up having a much bigger exposure risk just because of that. I've seen in terms, doesn't affect me, but in terms of kids' play dates, to go ahead and say, they're discouraged, but if you're going to do it, have one family that you get together with that agrees that they're only going to get together with your kids, and so you don't expand the universe of possible exposures that way. So during the 2-week, 3-week, 4-week kind of shutdown to minimize, exposure, think about that. Even if there's only 2 or 3 people in the room, how that can grow exponentially depending upon who else they're interacting with. And then of course there's the the advice from the Tribune this past week, which was if you have a steady partner, having sex is no problem. Can I get muted, or people?
We're just so politically correct, we can't smile or laugh at jokes like that.
I can fix
I'm
it.
with you because my chair squeaks. I'm with you.
So the bridge is unmuted, so everyone can laugh now.
Anything else from the group? I think Cal and I are done with our stuff.
Just of course the big thing that with the drop in the stock market, income and wealth inequality has had a significant drop in the last month. If you're looking for a small silver lining.
Remind me, what's that silver lining?
Well, that we're to the extent we're always worried about income and wealth inequality, there's been a
All
huge
right.
drop.
Uh-huh.
So,
You figure the stock is owned by, the top 10% own about 80% of the stock. The top 1% owns about 40% of the stock. So they're the ones that take a beating under these conditions. In theory, you'll hear anecdotes about some of them that bet against the market and made a lot of money, but the vast majority are losing money. That's Carl's right. That's what happens.
so
One of the reasons I've always said that don't wish for big drops in quick drops in inequality.
Mhm.
Because this is the kind of thing that causes them.
all right, Carl and David, thank you so much. Thank you to the participants that joined us tonight. We had a nice breath of people and some new comments. I'll just do a quick recap of a couple of the last comments made. To you, Maggie, Sarah said, think about billboards.
I have actually, but later.
And my mind went, well, there's nobody out driving, but okay. Also, Sarah mentioned that her stepdaughter is a pediatrician in Scarsdale, New York. They are out of mask totally. Last night, we found out that our Stand With Women lead has been making masks out of anything she can. And she did 30 of them yesterday, and she's sending those out to help out. And I tell you what we found out last night and talking with the leads and everything, because there's a lot of different ways that people are filling their time and finding ways to get information out. Our goal, as Carl said on slide number 2, was for the Fiscal and Economic Group, and this applies to every one of our issue groups, is to disseminate good information. And every one of our teams is working to get that done, both by voice and by video calls, but also by action. So that is great. Tomorrow night, same channel, our climate change team has Jerry Songer, the lead legislative director for the Northwest Suburban School Districts. She's going to be leading a presentation that pertains to danger in our streets and on our sidewalks, having to do with rail cars. She'll be joined by several people from the rail industry, and it should be good. This will be also online. She'll be doing a presentation, and we'll just kind of rock and roll. Everybody on this call is invited. If you want to see another section of how we are approaching these online calls, please join. You can join by voice, or you can join and watch the video and listen, or you can actually have your video up. It's been great to see people popping up and as the conversations and the questions been asked. Carl and David, you guys did a fantastic job in a very difficult time. Yay! And this is what we're going to be doing, so we might as well get really good at it and find ways of communicating with people and helping people. So, thank you all. Sarah, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if I was coming through or not. No, I thought it was great. Good discussions and information. And I think the format, we're getting through a lot of the kinks. Thank you, Christine. I think it's going to take us a while just to to get this down, but I mean, considering how short a time you and Bill and everybody else have been working your butts off to put all this together, so that's really appreciated. Thank you so much. That's all.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just remember that the work of putting this together happens with our team leads. They have to gather the data and present it and be able to converse with it. And so thank you guys. And Christine, just your ability to bring this stuff together is amazing. So we'll see you tomorrow.
I want to echo the thanks to Christine and to Bill and Matt and to Kathy and everybody else who worked to work out the technical kinks to make this happen. Thank you.
Christine, were we
Thank
able
you.
to
Have
get
a good night.
were we able to get a video on this?
I have captured something. I will see if it turns out, and I'll let you know.
For those of you who are interested, there's about 3 years of monthly videos that Christine's been putting out from the fiscal and economic team. It's up on the NWSOFA YouTube channel. So thank you, Christine. Hats off to you. Good night, everybody.